In the line of my calling as a hospital chaplain, I've stood at many bedsides and held many trembling hands. Hands that once built homes, carried children, played instruments, signed contracts, or simply reached for something or someone to hold on to in the end. This story isn't about the spectacular. There's no light flickering, no supernatural spectacle, just silence, presence, and something that called for compassion where systems had grown too routine to notice. Her name was Mrs. Evelyn Hart, 82 years old, a retired school teacher, diagnosed with metastatic pancreatic cancer and brought to our palliative wing to live out what we all knew would be her final weeks. Evelyn was lucid most of the time, wise, sharp. She had the kind of presence that didn't beg for attention but commanded it anyway. But on her fourth night, the nurses started to take note. She says she hears a baby crying every night, one of them told me in passing during morning rounds, sipping coffee like it was just another box checked. Probably delirium, her vitals are fine, but you know how these things go near the end. I nodded, but didn't say much. I've learned not to dismiss what the dying say. Not everything is a metaphor, and not everything is nonsense. Sometimes it's memory, sometimes it's unresolved grief. And sometimes, just sometimes, it's a story waiting to be heard. That afternoon, I visited her room. She greeted me with a quiet smile and that calm, collected voice of someone used to comforting others. "Chaplain," she said, "you might think I'm losing my mind, but I swear I heard it again last night. A baby, crying, not from the hall, here, in this room." She didn't say it like someone grasping at imagination. She said it like someone certain. I sat down beside her, not to fix, but to listen. "What does it sound like?" I asked. "Newborn, short breaths. Not wailing, but aching, and it always stops before I can call the nurse." She paused, eyes fixed on the ceiling. "It doesn't feel dangerous, just sad, deeply sad." I didn't reach for a Bible, not yet. I've learned that scripture, like silence, needs the right time. That evening, after hours, I sat down in the staff archives. Hospitals like ours, old, pre-digital institutions, have long memories buried in folders and manila envelopes. I didn't know what I was looking for, but something in her voice nudged me toward digging deeper. 3 hours in, I found a thin, typewritten incident report dated March 12, 1984. Room 310. Same room Evelyn now occupied. A young woman named Linda Travers had been admitted at 38 weeks pregnant. She delivered a stillborn boy in that very room. According to the attending physician's notes, she had gone into shock after delivery and wouldn't allow the nurses to take the body for hours. She'd held him in her arms well into the morning. The final line on the report read, "Patient inconsolable, repeated crying heard throughout the unit overnight." I leaned back in the chair, held my breath. Not for drama, but out of reverence. There was pain in those lines that had never been healed, only documented, archived, and forgotten. I returned to Evelyn the next morning. She was awake, her face already turned to the window, soaking in the gray light. I told her what I found, not as confirmation of anything supernatural, but as a tether between her experience and the unseen history of that room. When I finished, Evelyn didn't speak for a long while. Then she said, "Maybe I'm just meant to be with her, the mother. Maybe it's not a ghost. Maybe it's just grief that never found a witness." Those words stayed with me. That night, I sat in room 310 long after visiting hours ended. No prayers, no hymns, just quiet presence. I whispered, in the softest voice I could manage, "You were heard, your sorrow mattered, your child was real. You are not forgotten." Evelyn passed 5 days later, peacefully. Her final days were marked not by fear, but a kind of solemn stewardship, like she had become a temporary guardian of someone else's sorrow. A bridge. I've never spoken of it in official rounds. Hospitals don't track echoes of grief in their metrics. But I made a small note in the spiritual care log for room 310. When sorrow lingers in silence, let presence be the answer. That's all we can do sometimes as chaplains. Not erase the pain, not fix the past, but stand in the doorway of forgotten grief and bear witness. That room is no longer just a room to me. It's a place where a mother once wept and someone, decades later, finally listened. And now, a huge thank you to all my amazing viewers for joining me in these bone-chilling stories. If you're new here and enjoyed getting chills down your spine, Smash that like button and subscribe to venture deeper into the shadows with us. Each like fuels the darkness, bringing more chilling, haunting stories to light. Now, steady your nerves as we cruise into our next horrifying story. I've served as a hospital chaplain for over 20 years. My role isn't just to pray, read scripture, or offer comfort. It's to be fully present when people are at their most vulnerable. I listen without judgment, advocate when needed, and help people make sense of what's happening around them or within them. Sometimes I simply sit in silence, holding a hand. Other times I hear confessions whispered through labored breaths. Every encounter matters, and some never leave you. One of those moments happened during the night shift, a quiet Tuesday in February. The nurses had asked me to visit a patient named Mr. Ronald K., late 70s, history of heart disease. I'd met him before, a quiet man, polite but distant. But that night, his nurse said he'd been acting restless, said he saw someone standing at the foot of his bed, said he couldn't sleep. When I walked into the room, he was sitting upright, his eyes fixed on the corner near the footboard. I introduced myself again, and he nodded, but he didn't look at me. He just whispered, "He's here again. Do you see him?" I paused. I glanced at the space he was pointing toward. Nothing was there. But I didn't say that. "Can you tell me who it is you think you're seeing?" I asked. He hesitated, breathing through his nose. Then he said, "His name was David. I knew him a long time ago." I sat down. "Tell me about David." His hands trembled as he spoke. It took him a while to find his words, but when he did, they came with weight. He told me they'd grown up together, both troubled kids in a rough part of town, got into all kinds of mischief. But one day, things went too far. Something bad happened. A fight, a robbery, a night with too much alcohol and blame. Ronald got off easy. David didn't. He went to prison. And Ronald never reached out, never wrote, never visited. "I always figured he hated me," he said. "But I heard later, someone said he kept asking about me, wanting to know if I ever asked for him, wanting to know why I never came." There was a long silence. He looked at the corner again. "He died there," he whispered, "in prison. All he wanted was a word from me, a letter, something." He paused, then looked straight at me for the first time that night. "Do you think he's here for revenge?" I took a breath, slowly, thoughtfully. "No," I said. "I don't believe he's here for revenge. I believe your soul knows it has unfinished business. Maybe this is your spirit's way of telling you that it's time to let go, time to say what you couldn't say back then." He nodded, swallowing hard. "Can we pray?" I reached for his hand. It was warm and fragile. I prayed slowly, not from a script, but from the heart. I asked for peace, for Ronald, for David, for whatever had remained unspoken all those years. I asked for forgiveness to flow freely, even across time and death. And I asked for mercy. Afterward, he looked calmer, exhausted but lighter somehow. "You think he heard that?" he asked. "I think he did," I said. I left the room and walked down the corridor, making a mental note to return in the morning. But Ronald passed in the early hours, quietly, without distress. The night nurse said he looked peaceful, like he was ready. My name is Chaplain Ray. I serve at a mid-sized hospital in the city, not far from where the morning sirens blend with the smell of coffee and bleach. Over the years, I've walked into thousands of rooms, responding to calls that are sometimes medical, sometimes spiritual, and sometimes in between. The call came from a nurse I'd worked with many times. "Room 241, she said gently. "Mrs. Lorraine Foster. She's been murmuring, 'I'm sorry,' over and over. She won't stop. Says she's talking to her husband, but he's been gone for years. Can you check in?" I nodded. I knew what this kind of call meant. Not necessarily ghosts or visions, but unresolved stories, open wounds, and the quiet unraveling that can come at the end of a long life. I walked into room 241 just after noon. Sunlight came in through the narrow window, falling across the floor in long strips. Mrs. Foster was sitting up, propped with 2 pillows. She was frail, bones thin against the fabric of her gown, her hands twitching slightly with tremors. Her eyes were open but watery, as if she'd been crying for a while. "I'm sorry," she whispered again. I'm sorry, I'm sorry." I pulled up the chair beside her and sat without a word. When she noticed me, her gaze shifted, not startled, just tired. "Are you here to take me?" she asked, her voice dry and cracked. "No, ma'am," I said gently. "I'm the hospital chaplain. Just here to be with you for a bit. The nurses said you might need someone to talk to." She nodded slowly, then looked toward the far corner of the room. Her voice softened. "He's still mad at me. He hasn't said a word since he came." I turned to the corner. There was only a beige recliner, a folded blanket, and the silence of a hospital afternoon. "Who is he?" I asked softly. "My husband, Gerald." She paused. "He's been sitting there all morning, quiet, watching. He won't look at me." "Mrs. Foster," I said, "how long ago did Gerald pass?" 5 years, she whispered. "March 2nd. Massive heart attack. We were supposed to go to the lake that day. I told him I wasn't feeling well. Truth was, I just didn't want to go." She stared at the corner again. "He was already dressed, fishing gear packed. He made me breakfast. And her voice broke. I told him I needed space." Her hand fidgeted with the edge of the sheet. She kept talking. "We hadn't been right in years, but after our son died, something broke between us. We stopped talking the way we used to. We blamed each other, even though we didn't say it. But I think he knew. I think he died thinking I didn't love him anymore." Tears rolled down her cheeks. "I never said I was sorry, not once. And now he's here, and he won't even speak." I reached out and placed my hand gently over hers. It was trembling and cold. "Mrs. Foster," I said slowly, "grief does strange things to the mind, and guilt, it keeps its own time. Sometimes when the body weakens, the soul stirs up what we've buried, not to punish us, but to ask us to face it." She looked at me. "But what if he never forgave me?" "I can't speak for him," I replied. "But I can tell you this, the need for forgiveness is often the sign that love was real, that it mattered, and sometimes speaking what was left unsaid is enough to quiet the storm inside." We sat in silence for a while. Then, with her eyes still on the corner, she said, clear and slow, "Gerald, I'm sorry for the silence, for the distance, for letting my pain close the door between us. I loved you, even when I didn't show it, and I still do." A few moments passed, then she closed her eyes and her breathing deepened. She didn't pass that day or the next, but she was different after that, calmer. Not unburdened, no one ever really is, but more at peace with what had been. She stopped apologizing aloud. Instead, she asked for music, songs she and Gerald had danced to. She smiled more. She even asked for communion, which we shared quietly by her bedside. She died 3 weeks later, peacefully, without murmurs, without fear. In our work as chaplains, we often encounter what I call empty prayers, words spoken into the air, seeking someone who isn't physically there to answer. But those prayers aren't wasted. They're confessions of the soul, stitched together from memory and regret. They're a final offering of truth. And sometimes, that's all a person needs, to be heard, even if it's just by someone sitting quietly in the room. I serve full-time at the hospital, days, nights, weekends when needed. My role stretches beyond the clinical floors. I also care for the chapel, a small room tucked beside the east corridor. Few people know it exists, no stained glass, no pipe organ, just 12 wooden chairs, a small table with a cross, and a row of votive candles along the side wall. It's a quiet place, simple, sacred in its own way, the kind of room that holds more silence than sound. Most days it goes unnoticed. But sometimes, especially at night, it feels like it remembers things the rest of the hospital forgets. It began about a year ago. I'd walk past the chapel during my night rounds, usually just after midnight. The halls were hushed, lit by pale fluorescence, the kind of quiet that makes your footsteps sound louder than they should. But as I passed the chapel door, I'd hear something. Not voices exactly, more like the murmur of voices, a soft hum. Sometimes I caught fragments of old hymns, Blessed Assurance, Amazing Grace, but sung low, as if someone were humming them from deep within their chest. Other times it sounded like whispers, prayers maybe, but I could never quite make out the words. I started checking the room, just to be sure. Every time I'd open the door, the room would be empty. Still, the candles, battery-operated votives, were off, the chairs undisturbed. I assumed it was imagination. the product of fatigue and too many late shifts. Hospitals can play tricks on your senses, but one night I walked past around 12:30 a.m. I stopped. The humming was there again, this time clearer. The voice, female I think, was singing the chorus of "It Is Well With My Soul." I know the song. I've sung it at more funerals than I can count. My heart slowed as I turned the handle and opened the door. The room was empty, but the candles, every single one, were glowing. There are 16 candles on the wall shelf. I always turn them off before I leave for the night. I'd turned them off that evening around 9 p.m., just before heading up to a family consult. But now, each one flickered with a soft orange light. Battery operated, yes, but not motion sensitive. Not set on timers. They need to be pressed manually, one by one. I stepped inside and stood still. No voices now, no singing, just the low hum of the building's ventilation. I felt no fear, just something heavy, reverent, like I was stepping into a room mid-prayer. I didn't call security. I didn't file a report. Instead, I walked over to the candles and turned each one off, slowly, with intention. I paused at the last one. If someone had been here, I thought, they'd been praying. Maybe not in flesh, but in presence. And maybe, just maybe, that presence wasn't one to be feared. You see, hospitals hold more than patients. They hold stories. They hold echoes of last words, whispered apologies, and desperate prayers muttered under trembling breath. People come here on the best and worst days of their lives, and the chapel absorbs all of it. Since that night, I started leaving one candle lit, just one, before I lock up. Not out of superstition, but out of respect. And sometimes on the hardest nights, I sit in there myself. I light the others, hum an old hymn, and remember every family who's passed through. Every nurse who's prayed between shifts. Every soul who needed a place to let go. They call it voices in the chapel. But I've come to believe those aren't ghosts, they're memories. Love, grief, and hope, returning like breath, filling the space, reminding us we're not alone. Not in this hospital, not in that room. There are moments in my work as a hospital chaplain that remain with me, not because they defy logic or demand theological interpretation, but because they quietly settle in the heart like a stone in deep water, still but unmistakably present. This was one of those moments. I first met Mr. Callahan, John Callahan, on a Wednesday morning. The ICU nurse had called me in. "He's been asking for a chaplain," she said, her voice low. "He's not in critical decline, but you may want to see him sooner than later." John was a retired railroad inspector, 78 years old, widowed, no children. When I entered his room, the lights were dim, as they often are in the ICU. He had oxygen tubes along his nose and a soft whir of machines behind him. I introduced myself. He greeted me with a raspy, "Thank you for coming," and a weak nod. We talked. That first conversation, he asked me to pray. I did. Nothing elaborate, just something grounded, about peace, strength, and courage. He listened, and when I opened my eyes, I saw he'd been staring toward the chair in the corner of the room. "Do you see him?" he asked, still looking. I turned. No one there. "Who do you mean?" "The man in the white suit," he said softly. "He comes at night. He doesn't say much, just sits there, right in that chair." Now, I've learned in this vocation that when people are nearing the edge of life, their language begins to shift. The boundary between physical and spiritual perception can blur, but what struck me was John's calm. He wasn't frightened, he wasn't confused. "He talks to me sometimes," John continued. "He said it's almost time. I don't know what he means, but it doesn't feel wrong." I listened. I didn't correct. I didn't spiritualize it. I simply acknowledged what he said and asked him how it made him feel. "Peaceful," he whispered. "Like, I'm not alone in this." I visited him again the next day. And the next. Each time he mentioned the man in the white suit. He never asked who he was, never called him an angel, never described anything fantastical, just a presence, familiar, constant, reassuring. On the fourth night, a nurse paged me again. "He's asking for you," she said. It was nearly 2 a.m. when I arrived. John was awake. His eyes were focused on the same chair. His voice was fainter. "He said tonight," he whispered. I pulled the chair closer to his bed and sat down. "I'm here," I said. "I know," he replied. "Both of you are." He reached for my hand. I held it, and we sat in silence, 5 minutes, maybe 10. Then he closed his eyes, his breathing slowed, gently, no alarms, no rush, just a kind of quiet settling. When the monitor eventually signaled the final flatline, the nurse came in and nodded. I stayed with him a little longer, offering a brief prayer, more for myself than for him, I think. Afterward, I stepped out into the corridor, a long, still hallway, where grief and grace often pass each other in silence. I've often reflected on John's story, not to decipher who the man in white was or to draw doctrinal conclusions, but to remember what it means to be present. Because sometimes in this work, your task is not to answer the mysteries. It is to accompany someone through them, with reverence, with gentleness, and without fear. And maybe that's what John needed most at the end. Not an explanation, but presence. Someone to sit in the chair when the night got quiet and time drew near. Thank you all for joining me on these journeys. Your support means everything, and I love reading your reactions and personal experiences in the comments. If these stories kept you on the edge of your seat or gave you chills, please hit that like button and consider subscribing for more haunting stories. Have you ever experienced something similar? Or perhaps you have your own unexplainable story to share? I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Each of your stories adds another layer to our growing community of horror enthusiasts. And if you think someone else might enjoy a good scare, don't forget to share this video with them. Stay tuned for more spine-chilling stories, and remember, sometimes the scariest tales are the ones that could happen to any of us. Thank you again for watching, and I'll see you in the next video, if you dare.